So my name is Phil Rice, and I am here interviewing Craig Howe, who is he and I met so long ago. We were both in high school, so we met there and just kind of had an instant rapport where we felt like we were on the same page. We then were roommates at college at various points, and stayed very close then. And at one point, our saying, Craig, if you remember, was, "We're the same guy." I'm censoring that a little bit.
Yeah.
We were a little more
crass.
Yeah, we were college. And I think to at least some degree in terms of shared experiences and arriving remarkably at the same opinion so many times, or observing the same thing, or noticing the same things. Yeah, it did feel that way. Truth is, time has shown we're not clones of each other by any means. We still have a lot in common, but we are our own people with our own opinions and experiences, and but our lives have overlapped a lot, and we've stayed in touch over the years, more or less. And well, the time in your life that we're going to be talking about today began when we were both working for my dad's company in various capacities. And there came a point where forgive me because this is quite a few years ago now, but you were experiencing some pain in the abdomen or back area.
Low back.
Wasn't sure what it was. Lower back, was it? Okay. And you weren't sure what it was, but it ended up being more than just something about it was concerning enough to where, hey, this isn't just I pulled a muscle or I ate something weird. The pain, I think, maybe that's all it came down to, is the pain was intense enough to where, okay, we gotta see what's going on here. And the next thing I know, you're sharing with me that you've been given a diagnosis that basically says, if you don't do anything, you've got months. And it was quite a shock for me, and I'm sure for you and your wife and your family. And I'm going to kind of hand it off to you at that very awkward point.
Yeah.
Because at that point, really, my vision blurs. I didn't know much of the behind the scenes details, but I knew my friend was in some real trouble. And yet here you are. So maybe we can just talk a little bit about, from around that point to what got you here.
Yeah, there were, actually it was May 18th, 2007. So that would have been 14 years this week.
Wow.
And so, that was the diagnosis day.
Mm-hmm.
Several weeks before that, I started having low back pain. It was like, if you feel back at your waist where you can kind of feel your pelvic bone, it was kind of right in there on the left side. And so for some reason, it would always seem to flare up on Friday. I would get to Friday and that would start to hurt, and then I would kind of just be down for the weekend. And so you remember my role in IT at Rice. So there would be a bunch of tasks that I would keep a list throughout the week of things I wanted to do on the weekend when no one was there. And I would get to Friday and that would happen and I would be down for the count.
Right.
Trying to get over it. Maybe I can get in there Sunday, whatever. So we had a chiropractor in Naples, and I started going to him, but that wasn't helping. And I don't know if you remember, but at the same time, Mike Asbra was going through the same thing, the COO.
Okay, yeah.
And so we would compare notes, and he found this masseuse out in Cape Coral, and I went and saw her. Mm-hmm. Seemed to help, but then it would come right back to a Friday. And so I went to a doctor. I can't remember where he was. He was out in Lehigh or something. He did an X-ray. He just said it was a pulled muscle, but I could not remember doing anything that would have pulled a muscle.
Right.
Um,
He said that even after doing an X-ray?
yeah, he looked
So
at the X-ray. The X-ray didn't show anything.
So it couldn't, yeah, I was going to say, it must not have shown anything.
Yeah. So finally, that pain on Friday turned into these attacks, which I would have at the office. And I would have to just close my door. I'd feel like I was going to die. I'd lay down on the floor, and it would take about 20 minutes, and it would pass. And when I got up, the sweating was so profuse, it was kind of like a chalk outline, except for sweat on the carpet.
Goodness.
But once it would pass, I would think, your mind, once you pass out of that episode or dilemma, you're questioning how severe it was. Yeah. You're questioning, was that really as bad as I made it out to be? So I finally told Kristen we needed to find a sports medicine person, that I needed some kind of a rehab. There was something really wrong with my back.
Mm-hmm.
And she found a guy in Estero. He actually worked with the minor league hockey team. And so I went to see that guy on a Wednesday. And that would have been, because then it after that 7 weeks of buildup where it progressively got worse, what would that have been? That would have been the week before the week of the 18th. So that would have been on a Wednesday, whatever that was.
Okay.
And I went and saw him, told him everything. He said, well, we're just going to work together for a few days. And if we don't see some progress, then we're going to escalate. So I went and saw him Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of that week. And he just gave me I started having problems getting out of bed in the morning. And I would have to crawl to the bathroom, kind of a thing. So he gave me some techniques on how to get up, how to move, and take care of the back. And then Friday in his office, middle of the day, I had one of those attacks while I was waiting on him in the room. And so I was laying on the floor when he came in, and he just kind of pulled up a stool and sat there and looked me in my face. And he was just kind of like, describe for me what you're feeling, what's going on, yada, yada. And he just kind of went down a checklist.
Yeah.
And so that's when he decided, you have to have an MRI. And come to find out later, he actually stretched the truth, maybe falsified the truth to get me the MRI, which I'm glad he did. And so he had me scheduled for an MRI Monday. They canceled, pushed it back. They were too busy Tuesday. This was in Fort Myers, by the way.
Okay.
So I go at 7 or 7:30 for this MRI. The guy does it, and I can tell something's wrong by the way he's acting, because he has me he does it again a couple of times.
Uh-huh.
And then you can always ask for a CD. He didn't want to give me the CD. He had these excuses. So I leave there, and he's acting like very nice, like the way he's handling me.
Right.
So I leave there and come back to work, and I think I went to lunch. I was at lunch. We were living in Estero, and so I went home for lunch. And while I was there, that sports medicine guy called me. And he said, hey, what are you doing now? I said, I'm at lunch. He's like, yeah, I need you to stop by the office. So I stopped by on my way back to Rice. And as soon as I get in the room, he just comes at me really hard, like third degree. Like, what's going on? Who are you? That kind of a thing. And like, what have you been into? And blah, blah, blah. And in retrospect, I think he knew how serious it was. And he was trying to find a way to distance himself from me. Like,
wow.
He was trying to find something that I was into that would put me at fault so he wouldn't have to, I think, feel it emotionally.
Sure.
And so I didn't get defensive. I was like, dude, I don't know what you're talking about. He was looking for the way the disease presents in the beginning, if you don't know what it is, you haven't biopsied, is it's very close to AIDS. And because of the immune system, and it has to do with the lymphatic system.
Right.
And so there's a family of cancers, and so that family, there's a dividing line between that and a disease like AIDS. So he was looking for intravenous drug use, promiscuity, all this kind of stuff.
Right.
So I convince him none of that's at play. And so then you just see his countenance drop because he doesn't have any of those crutches to not care about me. So he tells me that it's serious. At that time, they said there were like 3 tumors on my spine, and a doctor would be calling me. And his was the first call where all of a sudden there's this chain of when you have a serious illness, doctors start calling you. You don't have to call anybody.
Yeah.
And so that afternoon at work, I got a call for an appointment for a neurosurgeon the next morning, 7:30, Wednesday. And so I go see that guy. He's in Estero. Nice guy. And he was trying to show me the pictures, and he couldn't get the software to work. And I remember standing up off you're sitting on that silly medical bed. I remember standing up off that bed, and I said, "Can I take the reins for a minute?" And I took the mouse and I questioned him on some things that he wanted to look at. And I went through the menus, and I ended up finding what he wanted to show me. And I went ahead and operated the different things. He would tell me ways to manipulate the screen. And so
right.
It was just kind of a funny thing. I've always remembered that. So it turns out it was 2 tumors, one at L2 and one at S2. And they were in between the vertebrae, and they were the one at L2. When you get down into the S region, the sacral region, there is no spinal cord. And so up at the L2 there is, and it was actually, the tumor was pressing in on the spinal cord. And so what I found out later was it was growing at 25% a week. And so for some reason, like clockwork on that Friday, it would be pressing in on that spinal cord. And so I would have all those symptoms and feel all those things. So he tells me we need to biopsy this. He didn't want to venture a guess what it was. He thought in the lymphoma family, but he wasn't sure. Mm-hmm. So I got a call that afternoon scheduling me to come in to see another guy up in Fort Myers. And so that on that Thursday took most of the day to where they actually went in with a needle and biopsied both. And so, and by the way, this is in season. So traveling to Fort Myers and getting back to Bonita Springs was kind of a nightmare. So I get back to the office. I got a call Friday to come in and see this oncologist. And at this point, my mental file on cancer is very thin. I don't have any idea how you look for doctors. I don't know what any of the questions are. I don't know what the different I don't know anything.
Sure.
And so I get this call to come see this guy. This was also in Fort Myers, very nice building. And Kristen went with me, and we waited. It was late in the day. We waited a long time. This guy comes in, and he didn't talk a lot. And for some reason, once I experienced this the whole time, they were fascinated with my crotch. I don't know why. They would spend so much time on my nuts. And there was, I don't know. Maybe I got a slew of weirdos, but it was very strange. So this guy comes in and puts me in the stirrups and just spends a long time on my junk. And so, I'm kind of looking at Kristen, and she's just kind of, looking the other way.
She's there.
Yeah.
Man.
So he wheels away and snaps off the gloves, and he's sitting there on a computer, and I'm putting my pants back on, and I'm sitting there, and he's still not talking. He's just paging through things and looking at things on the computer. And so, like I said, cancer file's thin. So all I know to roll off with is how long do I have? I've seen that on TV. That's all.
Right. Right.
And I'm expecting, oh, no, no, no. I'm expecting something like that.
Right.
He just turns his head and looks at me and says 3 months and goes right back to his screen.
Oh.
And so I turn and look at Kristen, and we just kind of look at each other like, all right. And so I'm like, so what do we do? And so it's at that point, basically what he's looking for is what he was in the computer for is he's looking for the different families where whatever I have would possibly fall. And he's looking at protocols. That's all he's looking at. And so is he the guy? Is somebody else the specialty? Where would I be treated? That's what he's just boom, boom, boom. He wasn't a bedside manner guy, which I learned later, the kind of doctors that I look for. He was the science guy.
Okay.
He paints by numbers, and that's fine. There's a place for those doctors. He's a stats guy.
Right.
I prefer to look for a doctor who is a jazz musician. I want him to know science, but I want him to be an artist. Okay. I want him to play off the page. So I didn't know that at that time.
Yeah.
So I waited till he fills us in, and I said, then he starts to talk, and he says, we're going to follow all the protocols out of MD Anderson, who is kind of the best in class. They kind of set the standard of research. They're out of Houston. He's like, we're going to do that, yada, yada. He's like, your care's, you're going to have the best of care, whatever. And he starts talking. And so the only other question I came off with was, what would you do if you were me? Mm-hmm. Because I'm thinking second opinion, but 3 months is kind of a clock. So he says, I would get out of the state. And so he said, you're fairly young. He's like, we're going to follow all the protocols, but we're used to treating older people, and you're a young guy. So he's like, if I were you, I'd want somebody more aggressive. It's not that we're not aggressive, but we're going to follow the plan, and we're used to the slower pace. Mm-hmm. So he's like, I'd get out of here. And I was like, well, like to where? And so he kind of names across the country the major places to go. There's like Sloan Kettering, I think, in New York. I think that's where it is. I didn't really pay attention to that. He mentioned Northwestern in Chicago. He mentioned Vandy, MD Anderson, and he just kind of went across the country. And so I said, well, my job's here. My insurance is here. How would I do that? And he, again, didn't really have any sympathy and just was like, people do it all the time. So he left it with us. Let me know what you want to do. if you want to come into the shop, we'll work on your body, whatever. And so we left just kind of in shock.
Wow.
So we get in the car, in season traffic again, driving back to the office, and I called my folks. And I just let them know what was going on.
How did that conversation go? Were you straight to the point too, or did you?
I was straight to the point. They knew that I'd been going to the doctor. They knew what had happened that week. They knew I'd been in pain.
Okay.
And, you're going to an oncology appointment, so everybody's kind of wondering,
Okay.
So
they already had a context from your previous updates.
Yeah, they had a context. I think everybody's expecting benign, but yeah, they had a context. So I got straight to the point, and it was a one-sided conversation because they were very quiet. And I remember at the time being disappointed at how quiet they were. I could tell they were emotional. Mm-hmm. You and I have talked about this before in the sense of when your parents are religious, their reactions to certain things, you expect there to be some dividends for that commitment. And so when they were silent, I was kind of stunned that they were so floored by it. And so the conversation just kind of wrapped up, and that was it.
Yeah.
And Kristen and I just kind of drove back to the office quiet. What was strange, she and I weren't really devastated. We were just quiet. There was, when you've worked really hard at something, especially physically, and you're worn out, and you get home and you get cleaned up, and you're fed, and you sit down in like a comfy chair couch, and you just feel that complete contentment, that relaxation, that everything that needs to be done is done, and you're just kind of relaxed. You feel good. You're not unhappy. You're not overjoyed. You're just super content, like, relaxed.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I felt. And I think you had made a comment around that time. You said something like, you seem relieved. And I did feel a lot of sense of relief because I knew what was going on. And so even though I was on the clock, or I knew my expiration date.
Right.
But I was relieved because I knew I wasn't chasing this uphill battle. So we get back to the office. I tried to do some things, and I was just kind of in that mode of my mind flashing off at things that needed to be taken care of, and whether or not I should tell somebody, whatever. And I think it was around that time that I set up something with your dad to come to the house. So that was a Friday. I set something up where him and your mom were going to come to our house the next day, that I needed to talk to him.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the back of my head, I was still bothered by my dad's, that conversation. And so we left the office. I think it was like around 6:30. We drove separately. So I left the office and I called my folks back. And so they answered the phone. And the only thing I said, and then we got off the phone, was, and I wasn't this emotional at the time, but losing my dad, it's in a different light. They answered, and I said, I need to remind you that this isn't about where I end up. It's about how I journey between here and there. And they were quiet again, and I just signed off the conversation.
Yeah.
Well, before I got home, they, of course, had been, I don't know who all that they were telling the rest of that day. But before I got home, my cousin called me. And at the time, he was leading the release, or had led the release for a very successful drug that I ended up having called Rituxan. And so he called me and he said, hey, I heard about what's going on. If you can be in Chicago Monday, I can have you in to see one of the world's leading specialists in lymphoma. I think she had been in Cambodia at some conference speaking, but she was coming back that weekend. And so he's like, I can have you in there Monday. Well, at the time, I'm thinking, Chicago? So I said, well, let me get back to you. Let me think about it. And, but that was what the guy had said, get out of the state. And so I'm thinking, okay, well, that's not one of the hospitals he mentioned. It was Rush University Hospital. I was like, he didn't mention that, but if she is a specialist, that's what he's talking about. So we got home And then the next day, your folks came over in the afternoon, and I just told your dad what was going on. I think I remember I apologized because I said, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to leave you hanging. And he told me, of course, that health is most important, focus on me, whatever. Do what you have to do. And so I kind of told him about my conversation with my cousin, and he was like, you should go. And so after that conversation, the rest of that day, Saturday and Sunday, was just kind of planning, how am I going to get up there? And my dad had a bunch of points, and so they got me on a plane Sunday. I flew up there. I don't even remember the flight. I remember I was stressed because of the episodes that I was having more frequently.
Mm-hmm.
I was stressed about being trapped on a plane.
Sure.
Got to Chicago, my brother lived about an hour south of Chicago. My folks were in Peoria, so go to my brother's house. Monday didn't work out, but I spent Monday working with Kristen over the phone. She's in Florida, gathering up all the records to get them to Chicago. Met with that doctor Tuesday and got kind of a good news, bad news scenario where she said, she didn't say it like this. This is my recap. The good news is it's not 3 months. The bad news is it's 2 months. Yeah.
Good grief.
And so the way it's framed a lot is, 2 months if you don't do anything. Well, the way it was in my situation was you have 2 months. We have a shot at one treatment plan, one strategy, and in 2 months we'll know if that works or not.
Right.
I mean, there's not a whole lot of time. So what I learned later about this disease is usually you die. So there's a few different forms. The form that happens in Africa, the endemic form, they die in a matter of weeks. They get a tumor that's in their jaw because this Burkitt's lymphoma likes to move into the nervous system, which is a closed system. So it gets in the jaw, moves quickly to the brain. They're dead really quick. It's called the sporadic form here in the U.S., which can take all different forms. My subgroup, you get them in your back or on your spine. And I didn't realize how aggressive at the time. And so my doctor started the treatment playing jazz, like I referenced before.
Mm-hmm.
And, at the time they do the bone marrow to find out. So I had 40% involvement of bone marrow. I had the 2 tumors. They checked my spinal fluid. There was nothing in there yet, which was good.
Yeah.
So basically she said, we need to start right away. And so this was Tuesday. So I was admitted the next day, Wednesday. They put in the port, and then I was in the hospital Thursday. They were supposed to start treatment. And that's when, Kristen didn't go to Chicago with me. She's still in Florida.
Right.
My brother had to go back home, go to work. My folks had to go back to Peoria. And so Thursday, I'm in the hospital. It's supposed to start. I don't think they actually ended up starting treatment until the wee hours of the morning on Friday. And I had another MRI. I can't remember if that was Thursday or Wednesday night. I think Wednesday night. It was like, and I have some problems with claustrophobia, and it was like a 2-hour MRI. I don't know what was going on.
Wow.
So I'm laying in the room. Outside my window is the United Center where Jordan played, or the house that Jordan built, I guess. And that was when, so prior to that, I always had something to look forward to. Another appointment, another this, another that. That was the moment where I'm all alone, it's quiet, and there's nothing else to look forward to. It's just starting. So that was probably the first time that I felt trapped, because in my head, I had this picture of when you get locked into that roller coaster car and you hear the bar come down and lock, and then the gears are clicking as you're climbing that ascent. And I realized I am locked into this thing no matter what happens. If things go well, I'm locked in for the next year, 2 years. If they don't go well, I'm still locked in. There's no way out.
Right.
Like, I could have something miraculous happen and I could be healed in that moment. I'm still starting the ride and they're still going to put the needle in.
Wow.
It took off from there. I went through 8 months of chemo. They would check my spinal fluid regularly, and I had 10 rounds of chemo shot in my spine. After, I want to say, the second cycle, they said, hey, I can't remember if it was second or third cycle when they reviewed, and my marrow was clear. And so things were looking up. They were looking positive. So we got the answer we wanted that, hey, it's not going to be 2 months. It's responding to treatment. But I still finished. Now, what was supposed to happen, I was supposed to get a bone marrow and stem cell transplant. So there's 6 levels of chemo, as far as one being the lightest, and it just gets more and more toxic or dramatic.
Right.
So the first 3 levels are all chemo. I think the 4th level's chemo. That's the most toxic. That's what I wound up with. Level 5 would be where you add in radiation. And level 6 is where you do the full-on transplant, or any combination of any of those, including transplant. I was supposed to get a transplant. The way that worked out was about the time we got to that 3rd cycle where they wanted to do that, insurance said you can't do it at Rush. You've got to go to an approved hospital. So approved hospitals was like Northwestern, MD Anderson. And so as important as the treatment is the interval of treatment, staying on. So I did go to Northwestern, and so my doctor was in charge of the hematology department at Rush University Hospital. I went to Northwestern and saw a guy who was, I don't think attending, maybe he was a fellow in the program. And so I saw him, he questioned me, and basically he was like, I don't think, after looking at everything, I don't think you need the transplant. I think you continue on. But he was more focused on talking about, I don't know why you're at Rush, you could come over here, we can offer everything. It was like a sales pitch kind of. And in the end, and this is just my feeling on it, in the end, I feel like he enjoyed being able to veto my doctor, who was in a higher position. So it kind of fell through. By the way, that was another place where he sent his this young guy who was, I think, an attending or something, and spent a crazy amount of time on my nuts again. And
has anyone ever explained that to you?
No. I don't know if I was just continually abused or what. But I mean, he was doing like these tiny circles. I mean, to the point where I finally raised my head and I was like, "Are we about done?" And he went, "Oh yeah, sure," and ended. So I mean, what was happening there, right?
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Anyway, all of that it was like, well, we just have to keep going. So we just kept with the chemo, which did work. It got harder and harder. The risk is either way is the infections. And I was very fortunate that I only got an infection one time. It was around cycle 6. And part of that was because of my family. So I was living at my brother's house. And so my family was super diligent before I would come home, they would clean everything top to bottom. There was a bathroom that I used that others didn't. Kept my food set. I mean, they were just super diligent. So I think that went a long way to prevent me from ever getting sick.
Now, just to clarify, the infection risk is because your immune system just gets destroyed by that treatment. Is that
Yeah. You go
long
in.
short of it?
Yeah, I would, and this happens to people. Most people on those first 3 levels are outpatient. I would go in for a week at a time into the hospital to get my chemo. And then after that, it's just about all your counts dropping. It kills everything off.
Okay.
And so when you bottom out like that, you have nothing. So I got an infection. It was around October. And the way they're hitting me with my chemo, they're hitting my marrow. So that hits platelets. Platelets stop bleeding. And so I had issues. Anytime your white counts drop, you get what's called thrush, which is anywhere from your mouth all the way through the tract to the other end. And a lot of people get these sores in their mouth. I luckily never got that. Mm-hmm. But I had problems in my intestines and there was bleeding. And so when my counts dropped and I have no white counts and then my platelets are low, so there's no clotting, I got a fever. I went in the hospital. I was in there almost a month, about 22 days.
Wow.
And it was just every day they would give me 2 bags of platelets. So a normal platelet count, the minimum is about 140,000. Mine got down to about 5. And so 5,000, not 5.
Right.
You just start to bleed everywhere. Internally, kind of.
Yeah.
Anyway, so every day I would get 2 bags of platelets. They'd get me up to about 38, 40,000. And they had me what I call pooping in a hat. They had this hat in the toilet, this thing that looked like a reverse hat. And then it's a teaching hospital, so they have these doctor posses that come around. So all day long there would be these medical students that would just file in to go into the bathroom and take notes looking in at my fudge ripple poop and then walk back out. Very strange. By the way, a fun fact about teaching hospital, so the shorter the coat, the more new they are. So like if they're just wearing like a white blazer, basically, they've just started.
That's really a thing?
Yeah. And the longer the coat, they're an intern, then they're an attending, a fellow, and then, whatever else is above that. And so you would just see all different levels of coats just filing in to look and take a note. It was very, very weird.
Wow.
But anyway, it was a long time, but that was the only infection I had. And I think a lot of people deal with it. Oh, another fun fact I learned, because in between hospital stays, I would have to go to the clinic 2 or 3 times a week. And they would, give me platelets. They would give me blood. They would, after the spinal sticks, sometimes that hole would not heal up. And so you're leaking spinal fluid. You get spinal headaches. And the treatment for that is they would stick an IV in and hang a bag of caffeine to cause the inflammation to seal that up.
Wow.
So anyway, I would go into the clinic 2 or 3 times a week. And what I noticed, anecdotal observation, is that people's families would bring them lunch and they would bring them soup. Because on the 4th floor, there was Au Bon Pan or some restaurant like that. And they had this whole line of all these crocks of soup. Well, those are community basins. So who knows how many hundreds, maybe 1,000 people would open those and dip, ladle. And so they would bring soup to their family member. And I think just about every time I would see somebody eating soup, before it was time for them to go, they would start to get an infection or crash or have to go to the ER and get admitted because they would end up getting... So
wow.
I ended up staying away. I still, unless I make it myself, stay away from soup. Anyway, wrapped up. So there's a lot in those experiences, but I finished up in December. I ended up finishing up all of the spinal chemo, I think by February, and then was released sometime in March or April, I think. And I ended up back in Florida, and I came back to work on the 19th. So that was the 18th that I kind of left, and I think I started back on the 19th. And in my experience, in my head, you just pulled through. And I started to notice stories of cancer. There was an actor that I followed. There was a show, Spartacus. The first season was good. He was in that.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
He had the same kind, the non-Hodgkins, right? I followed his story quite a
I
bit.
don't know exactly what kind, but he was also in his back.
Mm-hmm.
And he passed. Way healthier dude than me.
Yeah.
And so things like that were very jarring to me. I couldn't quite put my finger on why they were so impacting and emotional, but I was so, jaw hit the floor shocked when I found out he died.
Right.
Because I thought you just pulled through.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a lot of factors in that. And one is family and that support net. I think doctors are important. That's about it. So that's a recap.
Having health insurance, big topic nowadays. Health insurance was a little bit, less tampered with system back then. Wasn't perfect by any means, but did the insurance company, other than, you shared the one story of them kind of insisting you go to another place, but did they do right by you, so to speak?
Yeah, there were some things I had going for me. So first off, I had the first guy, and I haven't shared his name because I don't want to rat him out, but he admitted to me that he knew I needed an MRI, and so he wrote what he needed to write to get me in there. If there had been any delay in that later, what we found out with the 2 months,
mm-hmm.
If I had to wait or go through a bunch of other things.
Could have been it.
Yeah, it would have been it. And so fortunately, I had a guy that knew the system and did what he had to do. The other thing that I had going for me was I had done an HSA. And so we had to meet that deductible, which obviously, HSAs, it was large,
mm-hmm.
but the lion's share of that bill got covered by that. And then I had work looking out for me. So I think when I first left, your dad kept me on my insurance, I think, for a month or two. But then there was open enrollment in August, and Kristen was still working for you guys, even though remotely,
mm-hmm.
which may be one of the few or first attempts at remote.
Yeah, that was before that was a thing. Yeah.
And so I was switched to her insurance. So in the beginning, that first big hit was HSA, which is, they pay whatever it is they pay, 80% mm-hmm. or whatever that was after a big deductible. Mm-hmm. So most of it's cleared off. And then I switched to her insurance, which was a PPO. And somehow the combination of those two, I think when I got out, I don't remember the total, and I could be incorrect in this. I want to say maybe my debt was 10 grand, maybe.
That's it.
It could have been between 10 and 20, but I just remember thinking, okay, that's not a lot.
Yeah.
You always hear 100, 150, whatever, right?
Right.
So, yeah, it wasn't huge. The other thing is you can't go bankrupt over medical bills. Like, they can come after you and stuff, but it's not.
They can't do a lien or something like that.
Right. It's not like a credit card or, defaulting on a mortgage. So, you can put it in perspective as you get your legs back under you. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm, and usually with medical bills, as long as it's like, okay, I'm going to send you $50 a month. Even if that doesn't look like they leave you alone because you're like, look, this is what I'm doing. And you're making a good faith effort. So medical bills are different in that way. So when I see the entertainment, like TV shows or movies talk about how people are buried in medical debt and things like that with bankruptcy, that wasn't my experience, and it's not my understanding of how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So I was fortunate. The short story there is I was very fortunate that I had the HSA in the beginning. I'm not saying that's the be-all, end-all, because switching to the other insurance helped me too, mm-hmm. for the rest of it, the duration.
it seems like back then it was less common, or maybe just less of a headline, to hear about married couples or anyone other than single individuals not having health insurance or not being able to afford health insurance. I'm sure it was there, it just wasn't talked about much. But in the era of Obamacare and post that, it's kind of shown a light on those stats. And then with what happened to private insurance rates after all that government meddling, a lot of people that did have insurance before couldn't afford it. And just it makes me wonder, we probably don't have any way to know for sure, but it just makes me wonder what would happen if someone who didn't have insurance ended up, well, first of all, would they even get diagnosed in time, but then what would they do? Like, it just makes me wonder what would happen there. Would a place like Rush, welcome someone in if they didn't have insurance? Is typically the way you have ability to pay, So they in medical bills can't put a lien on your home or make you actually bankrupt, etc. But I think where the trick would be is that if you didn't have some means to pay, didn't have a company like that, it could be challenging to get the treatment in the first place. That they do have the ability to refuse service, I guess. It's not very common, I don't think. Not in this country. I don't think that happens very often, much as some would like to portray it that way.
In that event, I think a person in that situation would go to the ER. Like, let's say they had back pain like me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they would have at some point been diagnosed through the ER.
Mm-hmm.
Then somebody in the hospital would have come to talk to them about payment, but I don't think they would refuse them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's a narrative out there that makes it out like, well, that's what the private medical industry would do. But the truth is, I just don't think it happens very often,
Well, you also have, I remember there were all kinds of things. I mean, it felt like a huge mountain to climb. It felt like a huge unknown. But, we started reaching out to things like the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. And I don't remember how, but they sent a check. And I mean, this is just, nothing we've ever had connection to.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know about that.
And they had resources if we needed to contact or questions or whatever. So there were, depending on your cancer, I know that there's associations like that, not for profit, things like that, that'll help you. We got money from different places that were just charities because, hey, you have this. And whether or not it's, $1 or $500 or whatever it is, there's something that does something to your psyche that there's somebody out there, a stranger that cares.
Yeah.
That understands. So that first paint by numbers doctor that I saw, his words of people do it all the time, that kind of came back to, oh yeah, okay. So this has been blazed before. There's other people going through this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, you and I both were raised in a faith tradition, both raised Christian. Both of us, at least from our father on down, that's the way of looking at the world. And we both retained that, as part of our worldview. I think there were times in the college experience and with the philosophies and whatnot we got exposed to that there may have been questions and stuff like that, but ultimately it feels like that's stayed a part of our worldview. You shared some with me while this was going on about some of that experience of how that was impacting how you were experiencing some of the hardest, most difficult physical endurance aspect of the treatment. I'm not asking you to unpack that here today, but I'm curious about what role did that play, if any, in how you faced this down?
Yeah, that's a layered question. So I'll just kind of do stream of consciousness, and it may bounce around, and I'll rely on you to bring me back to earth to make sure it makes sense.
Okay.
In retrospect, at the time, going through it, like we're talking at the time, meaning fall, October to December range,
Mm-hmm.
there was something that happened the year before in 2006, I think around November. There was a guy that had been a friend of ours from church, believe it or not, and we had done a deal where I bought a car from him from up here in Tennessee, and he brought it down and delivered it to us. And so that fall, I had called him. We were waiting on tags and the title, that kind of thing. And so it was coming down to the deadline where we were going to have to register the car in Florida. And I realized I hadn't heard from him. And so I continued to try and call him and email and nothing. And so at a certain point, you just kind of realize that they didn't call it this, but he's ghosted me. And so I'm left out of pocket with this car that I'm not going to be able to register. And so I ended up getting pretty angry, and I was calling, bothering his wife at work. I was pulling every cord I knew how to pull.
Right.
And there was a day at work where I left early for lunch because I decided, early days of the internet, obviously, but I was just going to go home and mess with this guy's life. I was going to drop some time bomb. I was creatively destructive, and I was just going to go jack with this guy.
Yeah.
I was in the car. I was taking those back roads from the office out to 41 through the industrial area.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got to the stop sign and I'm waiting to pull on 41, I just strongly felt like I heard, not audibly, but in my person, it just kind of felt like God asked me the question, what if you forgave him? Which really pissed me off. And so I pull on to 41, and I'm just thinking about what forgiving him would look like. What if I run into the guy, just based on all the emotion that I had? What if I run into him? What would that look like? What if he, talks smack to me or whatever? If I decided that I actually forgave him, would that hold up, or would it be temporary to now? And so I'm, how you and I think. I was running through all these scenarios. Could I actually hold up and put this into practice?
Mm-hmm.
And before I got to the house, I realized that no, I couldn't do it. And so I just prayed. And I said, I can't do this. So if this is what you want me to do, then you have to change my heart. And so I think I was in, I don't know what car I was driving. I think I was in a small car. I think we had gotten a car from her folks. It was like a little Ford Escort hatchback or something. And so I'm all piled into this car, driving down 41 with tears running down my face, which had to look really weird. But my default settings were changed.
Yeah.
My BIOS was reformatted. And I think when I look back, if I had not forgiven those 7-8 months before that experience, I don't think I would have been ready for that experience. And so when that came along, I don't believe God, as once upon a time you would have said, a mean kid with a magnifying glass over an anthill. I don't believe he gives you disease. But I had this strange feeling when I was diagnosed and going through it. I felt like I had been trusted to handle it, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't explain it any better than that, but it just was this feeling like I could deal with that. So the forgiveness thing was important. Another thing that I learned sitting in the clinic, as bad as I felt or as bad as I got, there was always somebody worse. There was one day I was sitting there, I was talking to this old lady that was in the recliner next to me, whose daughter brought her soup, by the way. And so she, we're all bald. She's bald, but she turns and looks at me, and I had a port right around my clavicle under my skin. When she turned, she had this contraption. It was a port on her head.
Oh, wow.
Which means when they drill in your skull, you're awake. So she had to endure that, and then they attached this port. So she had chemo going directly crossing that blood-brain barrier. And that was when, we all know conceptually, there's always somebody worse, yada, yada, yada. I think in our world these days, it seems like we focus on people that are doing better than us. The richest 1% or whoever it is. There's always somebody doing better.
Envy, right.
That's unfair.
Right.
Well, my bent in that experience was that there's always somebody worse off. And when I saw that port in her head, I thought, man, I don't know that I could handle that. Clearly she could.
Mm-hmm.
So that started this experience with gratitude. And I think that's where the forgiveness issue came into play, why it was so important, because I was so grateful all the time and thankful, which came into play later. The worst experience, and it was actually an experience that it was the one time that I broke. And when I say broke, I couldn't go on. I couldn't do anymore. Was the bone marrow biopsies and aspirations, which I ended up having 7 while I was in Chicago. But they go in, they've got to draw marrow out, and then after they get the marrow, then they drill this like corkscrew thing, and they pull out kind of some meat from inside the marrow to do the biopsy.
Wow.
And every time I would go in, I would try to say, hey, can't we, knock me out for this? Can't we do some anesthetic? And they're like, no, because it's so quick, there's no need. But then they would also talk about the last guy who, fell asleep during the procedure. It was always not that big a deal. Nobody had a problem with it. But then, and they would hit both sides. So they'd position you to go into this hip. And going in was no big deal. They'd numb you up with lidocaine all the way down to the bone. You could, like little bee stings. But then once they got that needle in and they would draw, it would actually pull your leg because they're drawing that marrow out. And the pain would start. It would hit you and you didn't know where the crescendo was going to end. And so it would hike your leg, and then they would get another syringe and they would do a second draw. And that pain would kind of concentrate in a smaller area. And the third draw, it was just like a knot right in your hip. And that was the agonizing part. The drilling out thing was no big deal. And then after that 20 minutes, you roll over and you go through another 20 minutes on the other side.
Jeez.
So I was in pain all the time to the point where those marrow visits were the worst thing for me to look forward to. Because I was already kind of at the top. I was already saturated. And so there was one day when I'm sitting in the clinic and I'm looking out at that door and I have that appointment, and the nurse came and I couldn't talk. And she said, "Are you all right?" And I don't know how I communicated to her, but I just pointed at the room and shook my head. And she's like, "You can't do that today." And I was like, "No." And so she went and canceled it and got it rescheduled. Cancel part was great. The reschedule wasn't.
Right.
After it was canceled, I was able to talk again, but I realized I was broken.
Yeah.
I reached the end. So for the next week leading up to that appointment, that gratitude thought worked on me. And I thought, how about instead of focusing on what's happening, I take that time to be grateful. And then that turned into, when I'm in the red, when I'm so far down that I have nothing else that I can cope with, if I choose that moment to give thanks to God, then that would kind of be a validation. Because a lot of us, and I'm guilty of this now, we live a pretty good life. I mean, there's nothing really that I need or want, not necessities. And so it's pretty easy to be grateful or give thanks in that mode. But if I can be all the way, not only at the bottom, but in the negative, and I can take that moment to not ask for anything, then maybe in a spiritual sense that means a little more. It's more of a gift.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I started to practice. So at the height of that pain, what I hadn't done was prepared anything. So at the height of that pain, I think all I could get out was thank you, which had to sound weird.
Yeah.
But that became a practice. So as far as coping, I just changed my thinking, my orientation.
Mm-hmm. It's a very different response to that than I think what one could call the typical resentful "why me," to reaction to that level of hardship. It's in stark contrast to that. Did you ever have "why me" moments?
Yeah, I've been asked that before. I hate to be cliche, but my first thought was kind of more the why not me. I think initially some of the thoughts, I got on the internet, which I've told people and joked about. Worst thing you can do in a situation like that is get on the internet with no thought or guidance and just bury yourself in trauma. But I was looking at stats.
Right.
And I think stats are a lot better these days as far as cancer goes. At the time, I think a stat that I found was like 1 in 4 men in their life would experience cancer. And so my thought from the beginning was, and it has to do with that trusted idea, hey, I get to be the one so that 3 other guys out there don't have to be. Which made it, and maybe there's something self-aggrandizing about that, but it made it a little more palatable for me, that I would rather it be me. When my brother asked me a question when my dad was in the hospital before he passed, we were around the bed, and my brother asked me, based on my experience, would you rather be in the bed or beside the bed?
Wow.
And I would rather be in the bed. And that's actually selfish. Even though you endure pain and illness, you kind of at some points just go out of it. But as a family member, a loved one, you have to endure witnessing that. Much easier to be in the bed from my perspective.
Yeah, there's a paradox to that, isn't there? Yeah. Because what seems like the obvious answer is, well, you don't want to be, the harder job is suffering the illness or the physical hardship. But yeah, maybe not. Maybe not.
Throughout that time, I was very vulnerable, vulnerable to infection. I was very weak. There were times when I'd have to get out of the car to walk inside or to the hospital or the clinic. Or sometimes when I would, at my brother's house, finish a shower and the walk back to the bedroom seemed like a marathon. I couldn't make it. And I would have to call out to Kristen, and somehow she would have to get under my shoulder and help carry me and to drop me on the bed, and I'd pass out for a few minutes. As vulnerable as I was, what I realized, everybody is going to be that vulnerable at some point. And it might be in the few seconds before you get hit by a bus, or it may not be until you're 80 or 90 and you're vulnerable in a home or a care facility or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Going through that, that's what I thought about regularly, is I had never paid attention to those who were weak or vulnerable. And so I would look at people, not at the time, there wasn't social media, but now when I see people on social media that are just, they seem to be cocky or arrogant, or they're the kind of people that you don't want to hear what comes out of their mouth, or whatever it is, whoever these people are that offend your senses. They may not believe it, but at some point, they're going to be at that bottom vulnerable stage. And like I said, if I had not gone through that forgiveness moment to prepare for that, I don't know what that experience would have looked like. If you're not humbling yourself and you don't realize where you are in the order of things or how fragile life is, so everybody's going to have to learn that hard lesson. And so how much time are you going to give yourself to learn it, especially before the check comes due?
I know you're familiar with Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you've gotten to hear much of his lectures or whatnot, but for me, one of the most compelling ones that he has made is his psychological interpretation of some of the stories of Genesis. And the one that sticks out to me the most is the story of Noah. And his take on that is, whether or not that represents a real chronology of events. I happen to think it does, but whether or not it does, for him, it's what are we to take from that story? And because it's an archetypal story, it has survived all this time for a reason. It's been told and retold and retold and retold.
And myth, legend, it's been archived. Yeah.
And for him, what he takes away from it is very much in line with what he outlines in his books, and that is that we are all going to face a catastrophe at some point, similar to what you were just describing there, that low point. We're all going to face our flood, and the best thing we can do with our lives is to be as ready as possible for that in every way, ready mentally, ready physically, so that we can save ourselves and our family. That for him, that's what he kind of draws out of the Noah narrative, which I found it's valuable. I find that I think about that more, think about things more in that way of one way or the other. You're right. We're all going to face our flood, and it takes on a different form. For some, it's a physical ailment. For some, it's just the hardship of old age. For some, it's losing a child, losing a parent. These things are hard. Probably more people than we're aware of are going through something like that right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even some of social media's loudmouths under that veneer. And I can remember a good portion of my life when I didn't understand or think about that at all. I was one of those arrogant,
Oh, me too.
I still wrestle with it sometimes, I think. Probably always will. I want to thank you for talking about this. I know it's not, it can't be easy, I wouldn't think. And I appreciate you doing so. And my hope is that someone who listens to this will get value out of it and learn from it. And either as the person who's facing that thing or someone who's helping that person down the hallway, So thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure.